Hey, I'm Noel with creationeffects.com, and this is the second tutorial for Landscaper. Landscaper, real quick, if you don't know, it lets you create 3D landscapes in Adobe After Effects. And it comes with 1,000 different landscape elements to build your scene with. So you're able to create just about any type of landscape, including deserts, beaches, jungles, oceans, savannas, winter landscapes, aerial shots, forests, fantasy landscapes, alien worlds, you name it. Creating a body of water is as easy as drawing it with your pen tool. And once you build your landscape, you can set the time of day, so you can see your landscape in the daytime or at sunset or at night. And the sun and moon and stars are all automatic. And it's really easy to make a time-lapse effect and make everything in your landscape speed up. It's also packed with effects that you can use to enhance your scenes, like 3D titles or fog, waterfalls, haze, rainbows, shooting stars, birds, insects, auroras, and a bunch more. So those effects are what I'll be going over in this tutorial. The effects are found in here, in the effects folder. And I'm just going to go through these one by one in order and show you how each effect is made, how to customize it, and how to get the effect into your landscape. And I should mention that this is not required viewing. You will need to watch the main tutorial if you purchased the template, but this video is optional. It's just for those who want to learn more about a specific effect. But if you do watch the whole thing, I think you will learn a lot more about Landscaper and how it works. If you're looking for the main tutorial for using Landscaper, that's a different video, and I'll put a link in the description to that video. But let's jump right into the effects. There are a lot to go over, 24 different effects. So this will be a long tutorial. I'll go in alphabetical order, and you can just use the video chapters to jump to the effect you want to learn about. The effects are found in the Build Your Own Landscape folder here. And note that every effect has its own instructions layer at the top that explain how to apply the effect and use the effect. But it's easier to see it done. So let's get started. I'll start with the 3D warp effect. I'll open that comp. And I could spend a long time talking about this one. It's more complex than the other effects. But what it does is it makes your elements look 3D instead of just a bunch of flat 2D images arranged in 3D space. So let's look at this Namib desert animation. You might remember this from the main demo video, but did you notice the 3D quality of the trees? You can see we have some parallax here with different parts of the trees moving faster than other parts. Also look at the sand dune. This is all one image, but the lower parts of the sand dune, which are closer to the camera, move more than the top part. So it does this using a displacement map effect, which displaces pixels or certain areas of the image, warping the image in a way that makes it look 3D as the camera moves. And the amount of warping and the direction that pixels are displaced is linked to the movement of the camera. So if the camera goes from left to right, the image is warped one way. If it goes from right to left, it's warped in the opposite way. If you're familiar with the displacement map effect, you know that it needs a map to know how much to displace pixels. So I have a folder here with hundreds of these grayscale map images, over 600 images that correspond with the different elements from the element library. So that's the summary, and sounds cool, right? Well, big disclaimer, it doesn't work as well as I had hoped. So this is kind of an embarrassing effect to start the tutorial with, but to be honest, I thought this effect would be the highlight of the template, and people would add it to most of their elements, and when the camera moved, everything would look totally realistic and 3D, and it would blow people's minds, and I'd be a hero to all mankind. And I did a bunch of tests in the beginning and was pretty pleased with the results. And in fact, I had so much faith in it that I went ahead and made over 600 displacement map images in Photoshop, one for almost every foreground and middle ground element. And it wasn't until I actually started making the finished landscapes that I realized it didn't quite work like I envisioned. Not to say it's useless. I feel like it can be good when used on one or two prominent elements in your scene, but maybe not on a bunch of elements together, because areas of each image are warping in different directions and it can start to look a little weird. I think also that part of the problem is the map images are not perfect. I didn't test out each one. I tested like the first 30 or so as I made them, and then figured I had it down. But anyway, that's why I didn't talk this feature up or promote it in the other videos. So now that I've lowered your expectations, I do think the effect is worth playing with, and maybe you might get some really good results from it. The key will be subtlety. As you'll see, if it warps too much, it's going to look really bad. So I really only intended this to be a subtle effect that people would only notice maybe on a subconscious level, but it would add realism to the landscapes. So anyway, that's enough disclaimer. Here's how to use it. I'm going to grab an element from the element library, maybe a tree. I'll use this banyan tree. So I'll copy that layer and I'll open up my empty landscape comp, your landscape. I'll select the top water layer so that when I paste it, it appears right above the water layers, which is where middle ground elements like this go. And now I need the displacement map image for this element. So I'll go into the element library folder and open the displacement maps folder. And these are alphabetical, so I'll scroll down to banyantree3.jpg. Like I mentioned, there isn't a map for every element, but there is for most of them. For the most part, the background elements or images that are really far away, like mountains, those don't have map images because they don't need them. You wouldn't see any parallax in those because they're so far away. Anyway, I can just drag this layer into my comp. I usually put these at the bottom so that they're out of the way. And you won't ever have to mess with this layer. Just turn it off because we don't want to see it. And that's done. Next, I'll go to my 3D warp comp and I'll select the 3D warp effect layer here. And in my effect controls panel, I'm going to select these last three effects. Everything but the key light effect. So we have this little title here, which does nothing. Then we have the customization controls for the effect. So these are how we customize the amount of warp, and then we have our displacement map effect. So I'll select all those, copy them, go back to my landscape, and paste them to my banyan tree. And I'm going to close all of these because I like things to be tidy. Whenever you copy and paste a layer, all the effects open up like this. Adobe does that to annoy me, I think. And the next important step is to reset the displacement map layer. So this drop-down menu, this should be set to our map layer, Banyan Tree 3 map, which is way down at the bottom. All right, so our camera movement in this comp is usually 10 seconds long by default. I've actually shortened it to 5 seconds. And that's because you're limited in how much you can warp the image before it starts to stretch and look weird. So when that little bit of warping is spread out over 10 seconds, it's more subtle, and I want you guys to be able to see it clearly. So I've shortened the camera motion to 5 seconds. Here are our keyframes. Also, I've changed the movement to go from left to right instead of a dolly in. Dollying in or out doesn't work as well with this effect, and I'll explain why later. But side to side works, or bottom to top, or top to bottom, or diagonal, all that is fine. So one more thing I have to do is set my halfway time using this control up here. This should be the midpoint in seconds of your camera movement. So our camera movement starts at 0 seconds and it goes to 5 seconds. So I'll set this value to 2.5. If, for example, your camera started moving at the 5-second mark and kept going until your animation ended at 15 seconds, the halfway time would be 10. So you would just enter 10 into here. So let me explain why we do that. So this is how the effect works. I'm going to open the displacement map effect, and you can see we have separate properties for the horizontal displacement and the vertical displacement. So normally, as the camera moves horizontally, it will affect the horizontal displacement. And as the camera moves vertically, it affects the vertical displacement. Technically, it's not looking at your camera's position at all. And it's not looking at your element's position either. At least not this position property. What it's looking at is the element's position in your frame. So really, your camera could be still and just rotating or panning across your scene, and the image will warp because the image is moving across the frame. You wouldn't want that, but this turned out to be the best way to make this effect work. The amount of warp is linked to the element's 2D coordinates in your frame, and it's balancing the amount of warp on either side of your halfway time. So if we go to our halfway time in the animation, you can see the displacement amount is around 0. So the image isn't warped at all right now. If we go to the beginning of our animation, the amount is negative 250. So pixels are displaced a maximum of 250 pixels. And if we go to the end, we're at positive 250. So pixels are displaced that same amount, but in the opposite direction. So setting that halfway time is how we balance the displacement out. And it's how we can get the maximum amount of displacement before the images start to stretch and look really distracting. Now, the way it determines which direction to displace pixels is by looking at the map image. So I'll unhide this map and solo it. In a displacement map, medium gray or 50% gray pixels are not displaced at all. And any area in this image that's lighter than that will be displaced in one direction, and any area that's darker will be displaced in the opposite direction. So you can see with this map image, I've sort of painted the areas of the tree that are further back, like in these recesses of the roots. I've painted those black, and the areas that are close to the camera, I've painted a lighter gray. And notice how the bottom is just medium gray, because we don't want the bottom to move at all. That has to stay completely still. If the bottom of the image shifts at all, we would see it sliding along the ground plane, and it would look bad. So it kind of just fades from 50% gray down here to areas of more contrast up here. All right, let's play this back and see what we got. Okay, I actually like how the roots look down here. It definitely has more of a 3D quality to it. Where it gets distracting is up here on the trunk. You can see it's stretching too much, and it doesn't look good. And we can fix that. It's not unusual to see that because every map has a different level of contrast in it. And every element is going to be moving across the frame at a different pace, depending on your camera movement. So all we need to do is turn down the warp amount here with these controls. So I might have this, make it 50. And that makes this part of the tree look better. But I kind of miss how the roots looked like before, back when the amount was turned up to 100. So what I'm going to do is turn this back to 100 and then make a few changes to my map layer. Like I said, the maps aren't perfect, but you can always make adjustments to them. Oftentimes, if you're seeing a lot of small areas in your landscape that are stretching and moving in weird ways, you can just soften your whole map layer by adding a Gaussian blur effect to it and just turn up the blur amount a bunch to reduce the amount of detail and contrast. In this case, it's really just this one area of the trunk that needs less contrast. So I'm going to try something else. I'm going to pre-compose this layer. I'll make sure it's selected and go to Layer and Pre-compose and click OK. Now in the pre-comp, I'll just add a new solid layer that will go over the trunk area. And I could make this 50% gray like this, so that the trunk doesn't move. But since the trunk of the tree would be a little further back than the bottom of the roots down here, I might make this a little darker than 50% gray. And I'll click OK. Now I'll just add a mask over the trunk area and feather it a bit. Maybe lower the opacity a bit so we still see some contrast. And now let's preview that. I think that's a lot better. Every map is different, so it might be a slightly different process for your element. Like I said, just keep this effect pretty subtle. Just solo your element and preview the entire thing from the beginning of your camera movement to the end to make sure there's no ugly warping going on. And then just remember the amount of warp is linked to the element's position or movement across your frame. That's why it works best with straight up and down or side to side movements, because those have a more constant pace. If the camera is moving toward an element, the element might not move much for the first half of that camera movement, but as the camera gets closer and even passes the element, that element is going to start moving off frame really fast, which would definitely cause some unwanted stretching. Hope that makes sense. Anyway, good luck with that one. I hope you find a use for it in your animations. Let's move on now. I won't need to spend that long on any of these other effects, just to put your mind at ease. So let's open Auroras now. This will go real quick. This is just a pre-rendered clip of an Aurora. If I solo it, you can see the clip has a black background. So just use a blending mode here to composite it on your sky. And by the way, the reason you don't see all the other layers in this comp is because I have the shy switch enabled. I use that on the other effects comps too, so only the layers you need to see are showing. But if you want to see all the other layers, just click the shy button. So to get this into your landscape, all you do is just copy the layer and then paste it above your stars layer in your landscape comp. And this clip was made with the Aurora effect template, so if you want to make custom auroras for your landscape, you can pick that up at creationeffects.com. It's cheap, it's currently just $19. Okay, let's move on to the beach effect. I thought about ways to make realistic 3D waves, because how cool would that be? But in the end, I knew that would be, to make it look good, would just take too many layers and it would be too slow. So what I did instead was gather this collection of 8 ocean surf clips. These are shot from drones mostly, so looking down on the shoreline. And just like the images in the template, these come from pixabay.com, so they're public domain. And I've removed the sand from the clips and adjusted the contrast so that all we see is the white surf. They're all loopable and seamless, so these are ready to be overlaid over your water along your shoreline. And they can be tiled, so to make them extend into the distance, all the way to the horizon if you need to. And they can be curved as well, or wrapped around sandbars, all that good stuff. So let me show you how I would create a beach scene. You might do things a little differently than this, and that's okay. I'll go to my landscape comp and I'll double click my projected ground image layer, and that will open my ground pre-comp where I can choose a ground image. I'll hide that dirt layer and go down to my sand options. And you're free to use your own ground image if you want. I'm just going to go with this one. I'll close that. And I'll grab my pen tool to draw my shoreline. And it looks like there's a strip of lighter sand that goes this way. So this might be the more natural direction for my shoreline. So I'll draw that. And make sure it's a closed path, a complete loop. No need to invert the mask if you're drawing around the land instead of the water. So this looks really pretty, but the water's not like an ocean, so I can make some adjustments in the water controls up here on the control layer. I'll open the water reflection section, and I might scatter the reflection a bit because ocean water is really rough. So I would turn up the vertical displacement amount a lot, and maybe the horizontal just a little bit. Horizontal should always stay low because it does weird things. It can offset and slant the reflections in weird ways. And then to darken it, there's a water lightness control here, but I'll increase the tint amount instead. The higher you turn this tint amount up, the more it removes the reflections in the water. And an ocean isn't very reflective. The water is too rough. So I might turn this all the way up to 85% or so. I could change the color here if I wanted, but I'll just leave it. Now I'll open the water texture controls and adjust the wave direction so that the waves are traveling toward the shore. So think about if you just laid this control flat. You'd want the waves to come towards you like this and a little to the left. And the wave angle, I would adjust this to make the waves more parallel to the shore. This rotates the entire texture layer, so don't overdo it. Also, sometimes when I turn this up, I would get some flickering on the water. I think it's just a glitch, something with the turbulent noise effect. But if you see that, you can play with this CC wide time effect that I added here on the texture layer, and that might fix that problem. And lastly, down here we have the texture scale. I might increase that a bit to get bigger ripples. All right, the only thing left to adjust is the water's edge. What I'll do is I'll select my ground projection screen layer and turn off this roughen edges effect. This roughens up the edge of the water, but what we want to do is feather it, actually. So I'll open the mask on that layer and just increase the feather a bit. And that'll make it look like the sand is just kind of fading into the water. All right, I'll go back to my beach comp. So I can just unhide any of these layers and play them back and just choose the one that I like the most. Or if you want to see the original clips, you could go up in here in the Element Library folder and open the Videos folder and then preview them like that. And you can see in the layer names the resolution of the clip as well as the duration. The clips loop continuously and the end of it fades into the beginning, so it's pretty much seamless. If you were paying attention, you would see that fade, but I really don't think anyone's going to notice that. So next, just copy the one you want and go back to your landscape and paste it above your water layers here. And we need to rotate it, so I'll use my 3D gizmo and maybe move it back a ways and to the right a little bit to hide that edge. And you can see now the waves are going the wrong direction, and that's because I rotated it. I could have rotated it the opposite way and then the wave movement would have been right, like this. But don't do that because all the optional effects on here are set up to affect this side of the clip, not this side. So rotate it so that you can see the extension of the clip like this. And then to fix our wave direction problem, I'll just turn on this transform effect here, and that will flip the clip for us. Do that instead of flipping it with the scale property down here, because that will actually mess things up as well. Okay, and you can see this clip uses the screen blending mode. That's probably the best, but you're welcome to try other ones if you want. And the only other thing to look at are these optional effects up here. You can adjust how far into the distance you want the waves to go using this CC Reptile effect and the expand right property. If you just want a little section of waves, you can use the linear wipe effect to crop it. I don't think you can use a mask on this layer. It won't work right. You could make the shoreline uneven or wavy with a turbulent displace, and then increase the scale of the turbulence in here. You could add just a gradual curve to it with CC Bender. And this needs to be a positive value to curve it the other way. And this last one, Twirl, gives it like an S curve. And you can increase the amount and the radius in here. Just be sure to use the Grow Bounds effect with the Twirl to prevent it from getting cut off on the edges. Okay, let's keep going. I'll open Cast Shadows. So normally when you want a 3D layer to cast a shadow in After Effects, you just open the material settings and click Cast Shadows. But that's not going to work in this template because then the spotlight, which creates our ground plane, is going to cast all these unwanted shadows and it'll look terrible. There's no way around that. So instead, I have this effect. If you really need to cast a shadow, it's not going to cast it onto other 3D layers, but it can cast it onto the ground plane. And the shadow doesn't automatically cast from the direction of the sun, but you are able to control the length and the angle of all the shadows in your scene with a single control. So let me show you how to do it. First, I'll select the control layer here, and then I'll look for these cast shadow controls and copy those and paste them to my control layer in my landscape. Next, I'll copy this Cast Shadows Blur Map layer here, and I'll paste that into my landscape. The blur map is how the shadow is sharp at the base and then softer at the end. This is a map, so it can just go at the very bottom so it's out of the way. We don't need to see it, we can just leave it off. And we don't need to copy it again either, even if we have multiple shadows in our comp, we only need this one. Next, I'm going to duplicate the element that needs a shadow. And I'll just add shadow to the name here. And I'll move this below the original layer. I'll delete all the color correction effects on this layer, so everything except the key light effect. And I need to lay this shadow flat, so I'll rotate it 90 degrees. And just to make sure it's above our ground layer, I'll bring it up, maybe just 10 pixels on the y-axis. Alright, almost done here. I'll go back to my Cast Shadows comp and I'll select the shadow layer and I'll copy these three effects that turn the layer into a shadow. And I'll copy this title as well. And I'll go back to my shadow layer in my landscape and paste those effects. And then you have to reset the blur map. So open the camera lens blur effect and set the blur map to your Cast Shadows blur map way down at the bottom. So, and you can just repeat that process for any other element that needs a shadow. Duplicate the layer, rotate it, copy the shadow effects over, and then remember we've got our shadow controls up here on our control layer. So you can use these to adjust the angle of the shadow so that it matches the position of your sun. Let's go over the clouds now. As I show in the main tutorial, you can choose from a bunch of cloud photos to use as your sky inside the sky pre-comp. And you can even give them a little 3D movement using the sky skew control on the control layer. But those clouds aren't going to change shape or move across the sky during a time lapse. But these clouds will. These are made with the turbulent noise effect, so they can be customized. There are a bunch of options in here. You've got wispy clouds or extra soft or cirrocumulus, I think I pronounced that right, or stormy. So you can go through these layers, and when you find one you like, you just copy it and paste it into your landscape comp. You can select the moon layer and then paste it and it'll go right above the moon. and below the sun orbit controller. That's the best position for it. And you can see they show up over our sky pre-comp, where I already had a clouds photo. So we need to go to our sky pre-comp, and I'll turn off this cloud image. And instead, we want to choose one of these clear sky options. You can choose one of these images, but I recommend using this custom gradient here because it's higher quality. On the images, I noticed some compression artifacts when the sky is darkened with auto sky. Anyway, you can change the colors here. I'll just leave it and show you what that looks like. Now, we could customize our clouds using the controls if we want. I don't need to go over all of these. There's a lot of controls, and you can play with them and see what they do. But a few of the important ones, these crop controls, just soften this far edge to make the clouds fade out at the edge of the layer. In the texture controls, this random seed control will give you different clouds every time you change this value. The movement controls, you can adjust how fast the clouds change shape with this evolution control, or how fast they move across the sky and their direction. You can use negative values to go in the opposite direction. And then these layer transform controls, use these to position your clouds. So you could move your clouds higher or lower. Just make sure your mountains don't go through them. And down here, you can turn on this optional CC reptile effect to extend the clouds in any direction if you see the edges of the layer. So some things you can do. You could use a couple different clouds layers and give them different altitudes and make them move at different speeds, and it'll give it more of a three-dimensional look. I'll go back to my landscape and I'll turn on auto sky and I'll set it to nighttime. The clouds show up over our stars and moon, but if it looks like you can see right through the stars, you can adjust their transparency by using this boost alpha control here. All right, crop below water. If you ever want to have an element sticking out of your water, this is a quick way to do that. So I have this element here, and if I move it down, it never actually goes into the water because of how the layers are arranged. But I can go into here and just copy this linear wipe effect here, paste it to my element, and it crops off the bottom of the element at water level. Now, if I wanted to rotate the element, this happens, which that's not good. So what I can do is add a transform effect to this layer, put it before the linear wipe effect, and then you can rotate the layer in the transform effect. I should explain that this effect is also part of the reflections effect, which adds reflections to your elements in the water. So if you want your element to have a reflection, don't bother with this crop below water effect. Just go to the reflections effect here. Falling leaves, this just has a couple different pre-rendered clips that you can composite over your scene. There's this falling leaves animation, and then dandelion seeds floating across the frame. They're both about 15 seconds, and these are 3D layers. So when you copy and paste them, they can go somewhere above your water layers with your other 3D elements, and you can adjust their Z position as needed to put them behind certain foreground elements, and then just scale them as needed so that they fit the frame. Or make them a little bigger than your frame probably, because your camera will be moving and you don't want to expose the edges of a layer. These animations were made with the Falling Leaves template from Creation Effects. It's a great little inexpensive template if you want to make 3D animations of falling leaves or leaves blowing in the wind. So I have the URL for that in the instructions layer here if you want to make your own leaf animations. Let's look at Flocks. Flocks is the name of the template that these animations were made with. And again, the URL is in the description. It lets you choose from a variety of bird species and then make realistic flocks that fly wherever you want them to go. You've got lots of control and customization options, and you can even create murmurations. So it's a good companion for this template. But if you don't want the template, I've got these clips that you can just put into your landscape. There's some circling vultures here, and a couple different clips of some generic looking flocks of birds. These are sparrows. This bottom one, you can see I've animated it to move across the frame. So this clip actually just has the flock flying in place, and then you can keyframe the layer's position to make them fly whichever direction you want and at the speed that you want. These are all 4K, but they look smaller because they're 3D layers and they're moved back into the distance. So they're ready to just copy and paste into your landscape. And just like the falling leaves, you can just put them above your water layers and keep them with your other elements. Next we have fog. I recommend that you add fog to your landscape because it looks good and it creates a sense of depth. There's a few different kinds in here, so let's go over those. The first one, fog effect textured. I'll solo it. This one is made with the turbulent noise effect, like the clouds. So it has texture and you can animate it to move, like it's blowing in the wind or changing shape. And also it will speed up in a time lapse if you keyframe the clock control. Let's see how this is made. I'll turn off all the effects. So this is a solid layer. It's a big layer. It's 4K, so it'll work in both your 4K or HD comps. This first CC reptile effect is not important. It just works behind the scenes and makes the layer bigger when needed. And then we have this beam effect, which provides sort of our canvas for the fog. The fog will only show up over this beam, and the fog will be brighter in the middle of the beam and it will just fade out up here. And the middle of this beam is actually positioned level with the ground plane. So if I reveal the ground plane here, maybe you can see our beam is intersecting with the ground plane and we're just looking at the top half of it. If you want to make the fog higher, you can increase the width of that beam with this height control. But we'll look at these controls in a minute. Next we have this turbulent displace effect, which roughens up our beam so that it's not a perfect gradient, but we'll have areas of fog that are brighter and areas without any fog. And next, the turbulent noise effect is what overlays our fog texture over all this. And then the second turbulent displace effect is off by default because it makes it slower and isn't entirely necessary, but you can turn it on if you want, and it just adds some slow warping or turbulence to the texture. The turbulence automatically follows the texture as it moves. Next we have the linear wipe effect, which fades out the bottom so that it doesn't look like it's going right through our ground. And then there's a tint effect to add color and a couple effects for auto sky color correction. And this last CC reptile effect is optional. It's just a quick way to extend the fog if you ever see the sides of a layer. So above all these effects, we have lots of customization controls. Most important are these ones at the top, and most of the time when you need fog, I think all you need to do after you copy the layer into your landscape is just adjust this first control, maybe the second and third, but the way I set this up is the layer automatically resizes itself as you move the layer forward or back on the Z-axis. So if you want to scale the layer so that it's a little bigger than your frame, like this, now you can duplicate this layer to make a few different copies and then push back each one a different distance from the camera. And the fog will look smaller, but you don't have to scale the layer up. It stays that same width. Just be sure to use this control when you move your fog back or forward. You can't do it with the position control down here. That won't work. The rest of these controls you're welcome to play with, or you can just leave them at their default settings. Just make sure your fog is moving the same direction as your wind. So elements with the wind effect on them and the water ripples make everything move in the same direction. And lastly, I'll show you how to get this into your landscape. It's just a simple copy and paste. If it's somewhere over your ground plane, paste it above your water layers with the other 3D elements. If you want the fog in the background, like behind some hills, put it under the water layers and then it will be reflected in the water automatically. Okay, this second fog effect layer, which says horizon, is identical to the first one, except that the controls have been tweaked so that the fog is further in the distance. I liked using this a lot because it covers up the far edge of my ground plane. So that helps blend the ground plane with my background elements. And this third layer, fog effect simple, is for when you don't need all that fancy fog that I just showed you. If you don't need texture and you don't need it to blow in the wind, this one is super simple and fast, and it's perfectly fine for creating fog. All it is just a solid white layer with a mask. And it has the color correction effects on here to make it compatible with auto sky. So you can see it just adds a smooth gradient created by the mask feather property. So you can adjust the feather amount, or you can change the shape of the mask to make the fog just appear where you want it. And this is a 3D layer too, so just copy and paste it above or below your water layers, and then you can move it forward or back with the position property and scale the layer as needed so that it's a little bigger than your frame. And last of all, there's all these cloud or fog layers here. These are cloud images that came from the element library, and they have the transparent background. And I didn't ever use them in the finished landscapes that I made, but I included them here because I think they would make good fog. More realistic, but they just won't change shape or anything. But you could animate them to slowly move across the frame if you want to have them blow in the wind. Let's move on to the next effect, haze. Haze, or atmospheric haze, makes elements look like they're further in the distance by tinting them according to their distance from the camera. This effect is already built into all of the elements in the element library, and I don't really know why I put it in here, except that it's easy for you to find, so you can copy and paste it into your own elements that you bring into the landscape. So if you have your own mountain or tree image that you obtained yourself and you brought it into your landscape, you can just copy the tint effect on any of these layers and just paste it to your element. There's actually a few steps to turning your own images into landscape elements to make them compatible with your landscape, and I show how to do that in the end of the main tutorial. Heat haze, that's something different. This is the wavy distortion that you see in the air over hot surfaces, like above rocks, or maybe just around your sun, or just have it over your entire scene. So the first thing you'll do is you'll copy it over to your landscape. So if you're working in HD, you select the HD layer or the 4K layer for 4K landscapes. Just select that and the heat haze map layer and copy those. These are not 3D layers, they're adjustment layers, so they need to go somewhere up top, above all of your 3D elements. So right above the spotlight projector layer is a good place, and you could keep your map layer there too if you want, but as usual I'll put it all the way at the bottom so that there's less layers to look at up here. The map layer can stay hidden. Don't turn it on unless you're customizing it with the controls. And as usual, whenever we copy a map layer over, that means that we have to reset the connection to that map layer in one or more of the effects. So I'll select my heat haze effect layer, And for heat haze, there are two effects where we have to reset the map layer. So I'll open camera lens blur, and I'll reset the blur map to heat haze map way down at the bottom. And then I'll do it again in the displacement map effect. And now to limit the heat haze to just a certain area, all you have to do is just draw a mask around the area and then feather the edge a bit. And in most cases, I think you can just leave it at its default settings. But if you want, you can customize it with the controls on this layer. Just a brief explanation of how this works. I'll solo the map layer so you can see what it looks like. So it's just a turbulent noise texture that's moving upward, and then a turbulent displace effect that's warping it. And then on our heat haze layer, it adds two effects to your landscape, blur and warp. And both effects look at that map layer to determine which areas to blur or warp. So some areas are blurred and other areas are sharp. Some areas are displaced in one direction and some areas are displaced in the other direction. And in the heat haze controls, you have separate controls for the blur and warp. And you could also customize the map in there as well. All right, as it turns out, explaining 24 different effects takes a while, longer than I thought. So I'm going to split this video up into 2 videos. So if you want to continue watching, I'll put up a button for part 2.